Hello, and welcome back to Things I Want My Kids to Know with me, Ted Bradshaw. This is the podcast where I talk about the things I've learned as a therapist and I suppose as a person that I would really want my kids to know by the time they're grown. Today, we're going to talk about anger. And there's a few things in this. I think usually when people come to me to talk about anger, often in a kind of parenting context, like I keep snapping at my kids, what can I do? They're talking about, I feel like I'm not entirely in control of what I'm doing and I'm not happy with how it's coming out. And I think our first thing to talk about with anger is that there is a difference between anger, the feeling, and aggression, which is usually what we're talking about, which is the behaviour. So shouting, snapping, physical aggression. That's a set of behaviours. Sometimes anger comes out in a different way. It comes out in a passive-aggressive way. So I'm huffing with people or I'm just off with you and I'm sort of showing you how annoyed I am with you without actually saying it or without it escalating into the kind of more classic aggression, if you like. There is a difference between the feeling and the behaviour. And normally when we're talking about, have I got an anger problem or I have a problem with my anger at the moment, we're not talking about the feeling, we're talking about the behaviour. Because it's the behaviour that causes us problems. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But the reason I think that's quite important is because feelings are there for a reason. So particularly anger, like what is it? What's it for? It is there for self-defence. That's what it's for. It is a part of the fight or flight response. So if somebody is crossing a boundary or being aggressive towards you, anger is one way in which your body might respond to try and get you to do something to deal with that situation. And aggression, frankly, is also about self-defense. That is the purpose of it. It is to keep yourself safe, to push away possible danger. So it's important, I think, to think about anger in those terms, which is, it is not a good thing or a bad thing. It is a thing that everybody experiences to some degree, and that it has a function, it has a purpose. And usually if you're feeling angry, it is telling you something. Usually if you are feeling angry, it is because you feel in that moment that a boundary is being crossed, that you are being pushed upon, that you are being trodden on maybe, or you're being disrespected or pushed out the way, and there is something uncomfortable about that for you. That is what the feeling is telling you. You'll get sort of similar stuff in your body to what happens when you're anxious, but just maybe in a slightly different way. So your heartbeat will increase, your breathing will change, you might get a sort of bit hot and red, but it will come out, I suppose, tension will still be there. That happens in anxiety. So if I'm afraid, I will sort of curl up a little bit. When you're aggressive, it's similar, but it will come out in a different form of tension. So you'll get a similar sort of reaction in your body. It is part of the fight or flight response. The reason I really wanted to start with this stuff is because sometimes we are bothered about our anger or our aggression because we should be, because it's causing us problems and because we don't want to be like that. But sometimes actually what's happening is we're having perfectly reasonable feelings, but we feel guilty about it. Maybe because if you have had experiences with aggression in your history, or if you've been given the messages as you have grown up that anger is unacceptable. So culturally speaking, for example, we tend to do that to girls more than we do boys. Then you are possibly likely to perceive reasonable anger as a problem with you. Like, I am being angry, and rather than that being a clue that I am being trodden on, I'm being mistreated, actually there's something wrong with me and what I am doing is unacceptable. And that can cause problems too. The other final reason, I think, is because we're going to talk a little bit about the cycle of anger, I suppose. And one part of that cycle is consequences. And once you've done something, once you've said something snappily or you've shouted at somebody, sometimes there's this kind of guilt that you feel about what you've done, which if you have no way of handling, can then add to the problem. I feel guilty, I feel bad about that. Maybe how that'll come out is blaming everybody else. Or maybe how that'll come out is I will just beat myself up so much and I'm just never going to say anything ever again. And that can cause a problem too. If you can understand anger as normal and reasonable, maybe it's a little bit easier to respond to it in a helpful way. Let's dive in a little bit to if you feel that anger is coming up a little bit too readily for you, or you feel like you're snapping at people or being too aggressive at the moment. What can you do about that? So let's begin with how it feels at the beginning. So often how it feels when you don't feel like you're in charge of this is that there's a trigger and then there's your response, and that happens in a split second. So something happens and then I snap. However, that can really make you feel entirely out of control, because where's the opportunity for me to do anything there? So one of the first things we want to look at is, well, what if we really break that down? What if we really look at the last time you snapped or the last time you got frustrated with somebody? What was actually going on? I don't mean just in the moment that you snapped. I mean in the build-up as well, just a few minutes before. How it often feels is it's gone from 0 to 10 straight away, but that's not usually what's happened. Usually there's been a build-up to maybe a 4 out of 5 or maybe above, and then something else has happened which has tipped me further. So one of the things we can start to look at is, what are the early signs before it's got to 10? What are the signs? What are the things that start to happen in your body when you're getting to like 3 or 4? 3 or 4 out of 10, you're just getting a little bit annoyed, you're feeling a little bit tense. A small example I'd give is I tend to be a bit snappier with the people in my house, my wife and my kids, if I am carrying around some stress and some tension about something else, or frankly, maybe about family life. If there's a load of stuff on my mind and I'm feeling on edge, maybe I feel like I haven't got enough work done, maybe I've been trying to get work done and my kids keep interrupting because they're fighting with each other or something like that, and I've tried to keep my cool and then suddenly I haven't. It hasn't gone from 0 to 10. There's been a little bit of a build-up. And the early signs for me is tension in my body. So tension across my shoulders, sort of like a churning feeling in my stomach. Again, it usually comes from a place of feeling a bit stressed, so feeling almost kind of anxious, I would say. I am more likely to snap when in perhaps another time I might have been patient or more patient than I am being. So that's number one, is as in the build up to this situation, if you can think back to the last time you got snappy with somebody or you let your anger off the leash, I suppose, what was actually going on? Where were you in the run up out of 10? What was contributing to that? What were you carrying around already? The second aspect, so we've already gone from trigger. Before we just had the trigger and we had the outcome. Now we've got what was the build-up, what was the trigger, what was the outcome. And there's a couple of extra pieces in between. Whenever you have an emotional response to something, in CBT language, cognitive behavioural therapy language, we are always kind of looking for what's the interpretation. So what has your mind seen that has made it respond in that way? So if you're feeling sad, there will be something that has triggered you to feel sad. Sometimes that is something you're thinking about. Sometimes it's more of a automatic, like bodily reaction to something that has made you feel sad before or remind you of something. And it's very similar with anger. So it might be that there is a thought process. So for example, somebody in your family has just asked you to do something, and perhaps your reaction has been, can't you see that I've already got so much going on already? Can't you just leave me alone? What is the thing that really made you angry in that moment? That's what we want you to ask yourself. In that moment, if I was to put myself in that position, which has happened before, it might be something like, well, it felt like nobody cares about what I'm trying to do. I've got so much to do and nobody's paying any attention to that. They don't seem to care about what I've got going on. Nobody's thinking about me. So maybe, really, what's going on there is you felt ignored, belittled, or like you were being treated like you weren't important, maybe. Perhaps. Or it was a stress about not being able to get the things done. and that really you might have snapped at your child because you were frustrated with them, but ultimately a big chunk of that wasn't theirs, maybe. So what's the thought process? If you would take another example, I don't know, well, I'm struggling to think of other examples. I tend to be a little bit snappy is the main way it comes out in our house. But maybe in your relationship, perhaps if your partner says or does a particular thing and it really riles you up and you end up responding in a way that you're not happy with later, what was it at the time? What was it that made you feel so angry? Often it will be about having your boundaries pushed. Somebody is doing something that I don't like, feeling ignored, feeling belittled, feeling insulted, feeling like your self-esteem or your place in the group, I suppose, your acceptance is being questioned, or you don't feel respected. Those different things. Sometimes all that is you are responding to what is happening in the moment. You have been disrespected and it has made you angry completely legitimately, and that's what's going on. Sometimes we also try and look at, if you're able to break down a load of examples like this and say, okay, what was going on at the time? If you find that there's a pattern, that it tends to be when I feel like I'm being ignored, or when I've got a lot on and I feel like nobody's taking that into account. Okay, we've got a bit of a theme. So maybe it's not each individual trigger that tends to make you feel particularly bothered. Is there something about being ignored or nobody paying attention to what you've got going on? Is that what's happening here? So we've gone from trigger straight to behaviour. Now we've got, what was the build-up? What was the trigger? What was the thought process? What was the physical feeling? So getting to know what it feels like in your body. The reason this is so important, and the reason this really helps, is because if you know what it feels like in your body, you have a chance of spotting it when it's happening. And if you can spot it when it's happening, maybe you have a chance of diverting it, of choosing to do something different before you start shouting, or before you give somebody the cold shoulder for 24 hours, or whatever it is that kind of comes out for you. So getting to know it, sometimes what that allows you to do is maybe recognise that, oh, okay, there's patterns here where I'm perhaps taking things out on other people that aren't theirs. So for example, I snap at my kids when I'm stressed about work. That's not fair. Doesn't mean I can always stop myself, but it does mean that I have a better chance of going, what is this about? And particularly if I can see it in the build-up. So when I'm coming out of this office and I'm walking downstairs to go and see them all, if I'm already carrying some tension, like a 4 out of 10, it might be helpful for me to do some de-escalation before I walk in and respond to what they're undoubtedly going to be doing. Some of the things we can do are question our thinking and say, is this really fair? Is this really about this person? Is there any chance I'm taking this as a bigger deal than it is? Sometimes I'm not. It's not about belittling yourself or trying to convince yourself that nobody's bothering you. Sometimes you're just legitimately angry. Sometimes the answer is, no, you know what? Actually, I am being belittled here, and that isn't okay. We'll come back to that. But sometimes recognising what the thought process is finds you a way in to sort of say, okay, maybe I could look at it slightly differently. Physically, the things you can do, if you are noticing it early, is to try and calm your body. So similarly as we talk about with anxiety, if you can do some breathing exercises and some unclenching. So in an ideal world, what I would do every day before I leave this office, before I open the door and enter the chaos, is just take a few breaths. Take a few breaths. Speak to myself kindly. You are carrying some tension. You are carrying some stress. There is some stuff going on. But you don't need to take that outside of this room. You can leave it here. You can come back to it later. Taking some deep breaths. Just unwinding your body a little bit. That can be something you can do in the build-up. And if you notice yourself getting riled up, you can say, I can feel myself getting tense. I'm just going to go and give myself 30 seconds of breathing, or just a few moments of breathing, and then I'm going to come back to this situation and see if I can handle it in a different way. Calming your body is the simplest and most effective thing you can do, regardless of how you're feeling. Finally, there's expressing it in a different way. Now, as we've said, sometimes you're angry because you are righteously angry. You are angry because you've got, nearly swore, because you've got a really good reason. And maybe this aggression is completely reasonable and a perfectly legitimate response. Maybe you're thinking, well, some of it's totally legitimate, some of it is my own stuff, or any kind of mixture in between, but I'm just not happy with how I am handling it. I would rather handle it in a way that I can walk away from feeling okay about myself. In which case we can look at, how can I express this in a different way? So, if it tends to come out snappy, how can you express the same thing but in a way that you feel more comfortable with? And what I would say about that is you have more chance of that once you are kind of physically calm. So start with a deep breath. And then the kind of phrasing that can be helpful is just naming what you're feeling. So can I just say, I'm noticing myself getting a bit annoyed or feeling a bit frustrated. I think what that is when you've said this, I'm taking it like this. So for example, that's a bit difficult with kids, but you can still do it. So if I was to do that with my kids, it might go something like this. Look, there's a lot of noise right now and there's a lot of asking for stuff. I totally appreciate that you want things doing, but I'm already trying to do 3 or 4 things here. So can you give me a bit of peace and quiet? And I'll take these things one at a time. Is that okay? Or, kids, it's not all right for you to be doing these things to each other. I understand you've got your reasons, but I can feel myself getting a little bit frustrated. I'd really appreciate it if we can just be a bit kinder to one another. Can you do that or not? And maybe I'd feel more okay with that. Maybe there's still a little bit of aggression in there. There's a little bit of firm in there, and I don't think there's anything wrong with firm. Because again, holding boundaries, that's what this type of thing is for. But I'd maybe feel a bit better about the fact that I haven't flown off the handle myself, I suppose. I'd feel like I've said what I needed to say and I'm okay with how I've said it. That is worth thinking about. In my expressing and holding boundaries episode, there's kind of more on how you can sort of talk in those terms, but that would be the final kind of piece of the puzzle. So just to sort of talk about that a bit more, if you can notice it in the build-up, you have a better chance of breathing and calming yourself down before it gets to the trigger. And then maybe that means that when the trigger arrives, you're already in a better place to not get completely overwhelmed by it. If you can get to know what your triggers are and you get to know what the thought processes and things that tend to push your buttons are, you can do something about that. That might be about noticing that people keep pushing my buttons. Maybe I don't want these people in my life anymore. Or maybe it's people keep pushing my buttons, but I do think sometimes I take that in a particular way when maybe they don't mean it that way. Or maybe I'm taking things out on other people when I don't really need to. So asking yourself some questions about that and trying to do things in a different way. If you notice it coming up in the moment, trying to calm your body again. And then trying to practice expressing how you feel. So you're still allowed to be angry. That's the key thing. You're still allowed to feel angry. You're just trying not to express it in a way that causes you problems. So either particularly aggressive or passive aggressive. You're just going to try and put it across in an adult to adult way. I'm feeling frustrated about what's going on here. Can we do something different? It's very different to, will you just stop it? That's very different. I also want to talk about the role of holding things in for too long. So sometimes when somebody describes snapping a lot, when we break it down, actually what we find is that this person was annoyed before and they've been annoyed about this thing for a while, but because it is important to them, either perhaps to keep the peace so they don't want to rock the boat, or because they really don't want to be angry. Perhaps because they have had experiences themselves in their history of what anger can look like and how horrible it can be. Well, aggression can look like and how horrible it can be, that they really don't want to express any of that. So instead, they bite their lip. So all the time, somebody's doing something that's annoying me, and I'm trying to let it go, I'm trying to let it go, I'm trying to let it go. But what's happening is inside, I'm boiling, I'm seething, it's building and it's building. And then eventually something small happens and I snap. Again, that's sometimes what's going on when you're carrying a load of stress about work, but you can't snap at the people at work, and so your family get it instead. That would be a good example of, I'm holding on to it, holding on to it, holding on to it, and then it comes out. It can be useful, if you recognise any of that, to practice saying out loud the things that are bugging you before they get to a big thing. So practicing, even when it's a 2 out of 10, just saying, you know, I've noticed this thing's annoying me a little bit today. Can we do something about that? Because it is much more likely to come out in the way that you wanted it to come out. And maybe because you haven't held on to it all day, it doesn't come out as an explosion later. That would be another reason why we don't want to demonize the feeling of anger. If you're not allowing yourself to feel it, you're trying to bury it, you're trying to squash it, unfortunately, actually, it can mean that you do end up snapping, not because you want to, not because you're a bad person, but because you've just held it in for too long and the pressure has built up. So, those are my main things about anger. That's my little overview. I hope it's been helpful. As always, if you want any more, you can find a load of links in the show description, including how to access bonus episodes via Substack, where we've got episodes on all sorts of different things, including overthinking and sort of social anxiety and confidence, that kind of thing. Really appreciate you listening. See you next time.